Thought that The Avengers was the first big, high-profile, mega crossover movie made? Well, think again, because Godzilla had Marvel beat. Destroy All Monsters is the 9th Godzilla film released in 1968 in Japan under the title Charge of the Monsters. And this movie was intended to be the last Godzilla movie made, but as we've seen 50 years after this movie came out, that was clearly not the case. But hey, the franchise prints money, and if this was really the last Godzilla movie made, we wouldn't have had some of my other favorite Godzilla movies made. So anyway, this movie takes place in the futuristic year of 1999. Yeah, it's one of those movies. But anyway, all the Earth's monsters have been gathered together and placed in an island in the South Pacific called Monsterland. The monsters living down there are Godzilla, Rodan, Anguirus, Mothra, Gorosaurus, Manda, Baragon, Varan, Kumanga, and Godzilla's son, Minya. So this is a perfect place for all the monsters to live in peace, and humanity has developed ways to keep them on the island. If any monsters try to swim away and head towards the mainland, there are some barriers that are set up, designated to each of the monsters' habits. It's a little confusing, but basically, if Godzilla wanted to leave the island, he can't because of those barriers. And if you have a flying monster like Varan or Rodan, there's magnetic walls spread across the island to keep them within a certain parameter, but it's enough to keep them in an area where they can gather up as much food as possible from the ocean. Because if they didn't have enough food, I guarantee you these monsters would have been killing each other and eating their corpses. I've seen this movie a handful of times, and when they introduce Mothra and Gorosaurus, Gorosaurus is eyeing Mothra in this way where he's like, yeah, I'm gonna eat you. So everything is all fine. Nothing could go possibly wrong. Oh yeah, except that there's some gas that leaks into the island. It takes over the entire control center, it affects the entire island, and all of a sudden, communication from Monsterland is cut off. And once the mainland actually gets a hold of Monsterland again, they see that it's pretty much deserted. And on top of all that, all the monsters have been spotted in various parts of the world, destroying major cities. Moscow is being attacked by Rodan, Beijing is being attacked by Mothra, London is being attacked by Manda, Paris is being attacked by Gorosaurus, even though the newscaster identifies the monster as Baragon. We'll get back to that a little later. And New York is being attacked by Godzilla. So soon enough, humanity finds out that aliens are involved. Surprise, surprise. And this is an all-female race of aliens known as the Kilak, who obviously want to take over the world, but they've taken control of all the Earth monsters in order to keep humanity in line. And since this is an Ishiro Honda film, and one of his big themes is unity, you know that shit's not gonna happen. So humanity bands together to try to get the monsters back under their control and defeat the Kilaks from taking over Earth. Now, I want to elaborate when I said that this was the first big, high-profile, mega crossover movie out there, because technically, Universal beat Toho to the punch with their Universal Monsters, but the only major mega crossover movie that I can think of that they did was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and that was a comedy. That wasn't played seriously at all. So you could make the argument that Destroy All Monsters was very much the first big crossover movie made, because it brings in a lot of monsters from past Toho movies, and as I mentioned beforehand, both Rodan and Mothra are in continuity with the original Godzilla series. But some of the other monster movies out there, like Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Atragon, Varan, and King Kong Escapes, are not in continuity with the original Godzilla series. So Toho wasn't really working up to Destroy All Monsters. They were just like, hey, you know what? It's the last Godzilla movie that we're gonna make, at least that's what they said at the time, so let's just bring in as many monsters as we possibly can. It was just more like one last outing where they pulled out all the stops. They didn't really build up towards it like Marvel did with the Avengers. But anyway, when I reviewed Destroy All Monsters 5 years ago, I remember being slightly disappointed in it. I remember saying there wasn't that much monster action in there, a lot of the movie's a bore, and the only thing that's really worth your time is the big finale at the end in Mount Fuji. However, I was reviewing that movie just based off my memory of seeing Destroy All Monsters for the first time. With this series of reviews, I'm rewatching all the movies so I can get them fresh in my mind. And Destroy All Monsters is actually a lot better than I remember it to be. It's still not in my top 10 of favorite Godzilla movies, but now that I've gotten past the disappointment of a movie called Destroy All Monsters, it's not too bad. You still have a lot of great special effects sequences, and true, there are a lot of points where the movie's focused on the humans that are trying to get the monsters back under their control, but you do need those points. If the movie was just non-stop monster action from beginning to end, I imagine that it would probably get boring, even though there's just something so charming about guys in rubber suits stomping around miniature cities. But anyway, without the humans doing what they're doing, there wouldn't be that much of a build-up to the big monster sequences, which, when we get the monster sequences, they actually go on for a lot longer than I thought they would, and they're never boring. There are three main highlights for me when it comes to the monster scenes. The first one is when we're introduced to all the monsters at the beginning of the film. Just the idea that Toho gathered all these monsters together in one movie was pretty cool. The second is when Godzilla, Rodan, Manda, and Mothra attack Tokyo, and the Japanese Self-Defense Force tries to take them out, even though they apparently have the aim of stormtroopers because they managed to shoot all the buildings around the monsters, but not the actual monsters themselves. Kind of defeats the purpose of the Self-Defense Force existing. And then the third one is probably the film's biggest highlight. It's when all the monsters are finally under Earth's control. They meet up on Mount Fuji to try and destroy the Keelak base, but the Keelaks have one more card up their sleeves in order to try to take out the monsters of Earth, and that's King Ghidorah. And the big fight sequence with all the monsters, well, all the monsters fighting King Ghidorah is pretty exciting. The monster choreography is well done. Akira Ifukube's score really gets your blood pumping when you watch the sequence. And King Ghidorah really gets beaten up, so much so that the monsters actually kill him. If you thought King Ghidorah had trouble defeating 3 monsters in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster and just 2 monsters in Invasion of the Astro Monster, here he gets pummeled, and there are points where you feel bad for King Ghidorah, because once King Ghidorah is knocked to the ground, you know that's it, because Godzilla's stomping on one of his necks, Anguirus is biting one of the other necks, Gorosaurus is biting his 2 tails, and then in probably the most embarrassing way for a monster like Ghidorah to be killed, Minya puffs one smoke ring that suffocates the middle head, and it ultimately kills King Ghidorah. Yeah, there's really no purpose in having Minya in this movie at all. And this is kind of the point where I'm starting to jump on board the Minya hate train. Even though I can't say I flat out hate Minya, there's no real purpose of him being in this movie at all. So if I had any issues with the movie, is that while the human scenes aren't as bad as I remember them to be, some of them go for way too long, like unnecessarily long. There's a point when our heroes are trying to destroy the mind control device that's taken over all the monsters, and this sequence goes on for 1.5 minutes, and that's because the first time they try to take out the device, they're using this laser, and then 45 seconds in, it overheats and they have to stop. And then they just restart all over again, and we have to see the same sequence again with the same Akira Ifukube music playing, and it's just unnecessary. And then another issue I had is that a lot of the monsters in this movie just sort of make cameos. With that big sequence at the end where they're all fighting King Ghidorah, it does get a little weird when we clearly see Manda, Baragon, and Varan showing up at Mount Fuji, but they're nowhere to be seen once King Ghidorah appears. And in fact, the only time we really get to see Baragon and Varan is at the very end, and Varan doesn't even get to roar at all. He just flies up into the sky, and that's it. Now, speaking of Baragon, I want to touch upon something that I mentioned beforehand. Why is Gorosaurus attacking the Arc de Triomphe in Paris when the newscaster identifies the monster as Baragon? Well, there's a lot of different stories that are floating around into why this is. Apparently, Baragon was all set up to destroy the Arc de Triomphe, but this movie came out 3 years after Frankenstein vs. Baragon, so some sources say that the suit was kind of worn out and unusable for this sequence, considering that Baragon comes out of the ground. Other sources say that the Baragon suit was being used for something else, which I'm not quite sure what it was being used for. So whatever the case is, it doesn't really help at all that the newscaster reports the monster as Baragon, and I might have a theory for that. I don't know if this is 100% confirmed. It's probably not true at all. But when it comes to these older Godzilla movies, the special effects sequences are directed by one person, and then the human sequences are directed by another. So Honda must have filmed this sequence where the newscaster's listing off all the monsters and where they're attacking before the special effects team got to the Arc de Triomphe scene. So they just opt out to use Gorosaurus, because Gorosaurus is one of the monsters that's used a lot throughout this whole movie, and his roar is very close to that of Baragon's roar. Whatever the case, it's one of the most famous goofs in the entire Godzilla franchise. And there's not much else I have to say about Destroy All Monsters. It's really a lot better than I remembered it to be. The movie moves at a quicker pace than I remembered it to be. The monster sequences are a lot of fun. The Akira Ifukube score is obviously great, and the Destroy All Monsters theme that plays during the title sequence is my third favorite Ifukube theme from the Godzilla series. When I reviewed Destroy All Monsters 5 years ago, I said watch at your own risk, but I'm going to bump up that rating to good, but not great. Again, it's not one of my top 10 favorite Godzilla movies, but watching it a second time with an adult perspective, it's much better than I remembered it to be. And that's my review for Destroy All Monsters. Next time we're going to be taking a look at the next film in the series, All Monsters Attack, which really kicked the series into a direction where it was clearly aimed towards kids. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on the movie, if and when you've seen it. And as always, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.